Hey y'all, welcome to Kay's virtual baby shower.
Those were Shakiya Pridgen's own words, 3 days before she died. Family joining in from 5 states away on a video call, picking out a name together for the son she hadn't met yet. They landed on Kyren. Gifts stacked in the corner, her mother laughing in the background, promising she was going to get in the middle of everything too. Shakiya was 23, 9 months pregnant, 2 weeks from meeting her son. Just before 6 a.m. on June 16th, 2026, she was asleep in her DeKalb County, Georgia apartment. Her 1-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter curled up beside her in the same bed. Someone walked up to the back of that building, stood outside her bedroom window, and fired 11 rounds through the glass. The children weren't hit. Shakiya was. So was the baby she was carrying. Investigators would later say something about this. Didn't look random. This is the story of Shakiya Pridgen. Before any of this happened, before the sirens, before the mugshot, before her name became something strangers typed into a search bar, Shakiya Pridgen was just a young mother trying to build something steady for her kids. Everyone who knew her called her Ka. It's the kind of nickname that only exists because people love you, the kind that gets shortened over years of being said so often it just naturally wears down into something smaller and warmer. Her mother, Verdina Scott, used it. Her friends used it. And in the last video anyone has of her, hosting her own baby shower over a video call, it's the first word out of her mouth. Not hello. Not her full name. Just, hey y'all, and then straight into welcoming everyone like she was the one throwing the party for somebody else. Shakiya was 23 years old, and by the time this story starts, she was already the mother of two, with a third, a baby boy, due any day. A boy she and her family had just finished naming days before she died. Her mother described her, later, in the kind of language people reach for when they're trying to compress an entire relationship into a sentence for a reporter's microphone. A blessing. Beautiful inside and out. Well known. The kind of description that sounds on its own, like something anyone might say about anyone they've lost. But the footage that exists of her, the laughing, the dancing with her mother on camera, the way she hosted her own shower like she was more excited for everyone else in the room than she was for herself, makes it feel less like a eulogy and more like a fact. According to her family, Shakiya had recently moved into her own apartment, her first one, on her own, at the Woods at Pepper Tree in unincorporated Decatur, DeKalb County, Georgia. If you've ever lived through that particular milestone, the first lease with just your name on it, the first place where every decision about how to live is entirely yours. It means something. It's not just an address, it's a marker. A young mother, building a life for her children under her own roof, on her own terms, for what might have been the first time in her adult life. She grew up, at least in part, around Charlotte, North Carolina, attending Yorkchester Middle School and going to church in Gastonia, according to family members who spoke with local news after her death. That detail matters more than it might seem to on the surface, because it means Shakiya's story doesn't begin in Georgia. It begins somewhere else, with a childhood, a school, a church community, the ordinary architecture of a life, before it ever intersects with DeKalb County at all. By the time she was 23, she had 2 young children and was expecting a third. Her mother, Verdina, lived in the same apartment complex, close enough that when everything went wrong, she'd be at her daughter's door within minutes. That closeness, that decision to live near each other, wasn't incidental. It was the kind of arrangement families make when they're trying to build a support system, when grandmother and daughter and grandchildren are meant to be woven together, in and out of each other's doors, on ordinary days that were supposed to keep being ordinary. We're going to walk through what happened to Shakiya and to the son she was carrying, Kyren, as carefully and as fairly as we can, using only what's been confirmed through court records, police statements, and on-the-record interviews with her family. There's still a great deal that is disputed or unconfirmed or waiting on a courtroom to resolve. We'll flag that clearly as we go. But before any of that, before the investigation, before the arrest, before the charges, we want you to understand who Shakiya was in the days right before this happened. Because 3 days before she died, she wasn't preparing for an ending. She was preparing for a beginning. On a Sunday in June of 2026, Shakia's apartment filled up with noise in the best possible way. It wasn't a traditional shower, not entirely. Some of her family joined from 5 different states, stitched together over a video call, the kind of modern arrangement families use now when distance can't be allowed to get in the way of showing up for each other. Her mother was there in person, and on camera, too, laughing, telling everyone, "I'm in here with y'all, ain't I?" Making sure nobody forgot Grandma was fully in the mix. There were gifts stacked in the corner of the living room. There was a moment, captured on video, of mother and daughter being encouraged to do their thing for the camera. The kind of playful, half-embarrassed dancing that happens at family gatherings when someone insists on getting it on video, and everyone pretends to resist for exactly 3 seconds before giving in. And there was the naming. Shakiya was expecting a son. She hadn't met him yet, but by the end of that shower, he had a name. The family landed on Kyren. Not a name Shakiya picked alone in a quiet moment and simply announced, but one chosen together, in that call, in front of family, as something everyone got to be part of. A shared decision, the kind that turns a due date into an actual person before he's even born. She was full term. 9 months along, due within roughly 2 weeks. Every photo, every clip from that afternoon shows a young woman who looked, by every outward measure, like someone standing at the very edge of the next chapter of her life. Not the end of it. According to investigators, this baby shower would later become part of the story in a way no one at that party could have imagined. Court documents allege that the choice of the name Kyren, a name Shakiya and her family had settled on together, was a point of disagreement for someone else, someone who was not in that room, not on that call, and who, according to the arrest affidavit later obtained by legal reporters, did not agree with it. We're not going to speculate beyond what's been formally alleged. But hold on to this image. A mother, surrounded by family, naming her son. Because 3 days later, that same apartment, the one with gifts still stacked in the corner, decorations still up on the walls, would become a crime scene. This was the last full day of joy this family got to have together before everything changed. It was just before 6 a.m. on June 16th, 2026, when it happened. DeKalb County police records placed the initial 911 call closer to 5:15 a.m. The exact minute matters less than what those early morning hours represent. That narrow, quiet window when most of a community is still asleep, when an apartment complex like the Woods at Peppertree is at its stillest. Shakiya was in bed, her 2 children curled beside her the way small children do, treating a shared bed as the safest place in the world, because for their entire lives, it had been. According to the probable cause affidavit later reviewed by legal reporters, someone approached the back of the building, walked up to the exterior of Shakiya's bedroom window, and began firing. Investigators would later determine that approximately 11 rounds were fired through that window into the room. Not a single shot. Not a spray in panic from a moving vehicle. 11 rounds, aimed through glass, into a bedroom where a woman 9 months pregnant and 2 small children were sleeping. Shakiya's father, Pridgen, would later put it to reporters in words that are hard to walk past without pausing. Whoever did this aimed through the window, took the time to let off 8 shots. His count differs slightly from the number later cited in the arrest affidavit, which is common in the chaotic early hours of any case like this, before official ballistics findings are finalized. You didn't bang, bang, and run. You sat there. He continued, they knew she was in there. They knew where her bed was. That detail, the precision, the apparent certainty about which window, which room, which side of the bed, is what transformed this, almost immediately, from a question of who into a question that felt, to Shakiya's family, disturbingly answerable. You don't get that kind of accuracy from a stranger. You get it from familiarity. From someone who had been inside that apartment before, who knew its layout, who knew exactly where Shakiya slept and when. Her 2 children were, by what can only be described as sheer chance, physically untouched. A 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, inches from where the rounds struck, unharmed. Shakiya was hit. According to reporting from Law and Crime and multiple Atlanta television affiliates, she suffered multiple gunshot wounds, including wounds to her stomach and shoulder area. We're intentionally not going to walk through clinical detail here. What matters for this story is what happened next and what it meant for the two people who did not survive that morning. Verdina Scott lived in the same apartment complex as her daughter, close enough that when the gunfire came, she heard it from her own home. At that moment, she didn't know it was Shakiya's window the shots had come through. She didn't know, in those first disorienting seconds after the sound of gunfire breaks a quiet morning, that the person on the other side of that violence was her own daughter. That kind of not knowing, the seconds before the specific horror sets in, is its own particular kind of cruelty, one that anyone who has lived through a family emergency will recognize instantly. She got to the apartment, and what she found there is something she would later describe to reporters in devastatingly plain language. When I got there, she was unresponsive in the bed, and she was bleeding from her stomach. Scott told Fox 5 Atlanta. She didn't wait for paramedics. She began performing CPR herself, on her own daughter, in that bedroom, doing what she could with what she had, while help was still on its way. I heard her last breath, she said. I just prayed that they could resuscitate her and bring her back. I tried CPR before the ambulance and the police got here. I did the best I could. There is nothing in true crime storytelling that adequately prepares you for a detail like that. A mother performing chest compressions on her own child in the same apartment where, 3 days earlier, that same child had been dancing on camera at her own baby shower. Paramedics arrived and transported Shakiya to Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, one of the region's major trauma centers. Despite the efforts of first responders and hospital staff, she did not survive. Her unborn son, Kyren, also did not survive. 2 DeKalb County crime scene investigation vans were on scene at the apartment complex that morning, according to local news reporting, collecting and preserving evidence. Investigators were seen speaking with neighbors and other family members, many of whom, according to on-scene reporting, were visibly shaken, hugging each other in the early morning light outside a building that 3 days earlier had held a party. By that afternoon, Shakiya's family was standing outside that same apartment complex in the rain, speaking to reporters. And what's striking, watching that footage back, is how little uncertainty there was in what they said. They weren't speculating in the vague, tentative way families often do in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy when the full picture hasn't yet come into focus. They spoke like people who already believed they knew who was responsible. If this story has affected you so far, we'd ask that you consider subscribing before we continue. Not because we need the number, but because cases like this move fast in the news cycle, and we want to be able to bring you every update as it happens accurately, without sensationalizing what this family is going through. Standing outside the apartment complex that day, Shakiya's family didn't hesitate. He knew where she was. He knew where her bed was, one family member told reporters. Another described the person they believed was responsible in blunter terms. Someone who had spent time presenting himself, publicly and within the family, as caring. Someone who, in their eyes, had been performing a role that turned out to be nothing like the truth underneath it. According to Shakiya's family, the person believed responsible for the shooting was the father of the child she was carrying. Someone she had recently been in a relationship with, and who, according to later court filings, had broken up with her not long before her death. We want to be careful here, the same way we're careful in every case we cover on this channel. At the time these statements were made outside the apartment complex, no arrest had yet occurred. Under the law, anyone eventually charged in a case like this is entitled to a presumption of innocence unless and until a court determines otherwise. What we're describing in this chapter is what Shakiya's family believed and said publicly in the hours after her death, not a settled legal fact. That said, their instincts, whatever led to them, would prove to align closely with where the investigation was heading. DeKalb County Sheriff Melody Maddox activated a joint operation with the United States Marshals Service almost immediately. Within roughly 24 hours of the shooting, investigators had identified a suspect and traced him to a home in Riverdale, Georgia, a city in neighboring Clayton County, roughly 20 miles from the crime scene. As sheriff, I believe it is paramount that I use my authority to ensure that we work tirelessly to apprehend dangerous individuals who threaten the safety of our residents. Sheriff Maddox said in a statement following the arrest. This act of senseless violence claimed the lives of a young mother and her unborn child, devastating a family and our community. The man taken into custody that evening was 26-year-old Devin Anthony. Devin Lamar, Anthony was booked into the DeKalb County Jail and held without bond. He was charged with malice murder, feticide, aggravated assault with intent to murder, and, according to later reporting from Law and Crime, an additional charge of felon in possession of a firearm, meaning he was legally barred from owning a gun at all at the time of the shooting. Feticide is a specific, separate charge under Georgia law. The intentional killing of an unborn child by harming the mother. Prosecutors weren't simply charging Anthony with Shakiya's death. They were charging him, separately, with the death of the son she was carrying, days after that son had finally been given a name. According to a probable cause arrest affidavit later obtained by Law and Crime, investigators allege that Anthony walked up to the exterior of the bedroom window where he knew Shakiya and the children were sleeping and fired 11 shots into the room. The affidavit also reportedly ties Anthony to the scene through traffic camera footage, which investigators say placed his vehicle in the area around the time of the shooting. And then there's the detail that, more than almost anything else in this case, complicates the picture of what happened and why. According to that same affidavit, Anthony and Shakiya had recently ended their relationship amid allegations of infidelity. And among the tensions between them, investigators cite Shakiya's decision, along with her family, to name the baby Kyren, a name the affidavit says Anthony did not agree with. It's a genuinely difficult detail to process. If the affidavit's account is accurate, then the same choice that filled Shakiya's apartment with laughter and celebration 3 days earlier, gathering family from 5 states away just to pick a name together, was, to someone outside that circle, a source of resentment serious enough to reference in the context of an alleged murder. We want to underscore, again, that these are allegations contained in a legal document, not a proven fact established at trial. Anthony has not yet gone before a jury. But it's important that we lay out what investigators themselves have alleged, because it's the closest thing to an official account of motive that currently exists in this case. Family members told reporters they believed Devin Anthony was, in fact, the father of the child Shakiya was carrying, meaning that if the state's case is accurate, a father is accused of killing the mother of his own child, days after that child had finally been named. Do you think a disagreement over something as personal as a name for a child could really sit at the center of something like this? Or do you think, like some of the reporting suggests, that this may have simply been the visible flashpoint in a much longer pattern that hadn't yet come to light? It's a question worth thinking about, because as we're about to walk through, this wasn't the first time Devin Anthony's name had appeared in connection with a homicide investigation. If this case ended with the arrest, it would already be a devastating story. But what turned this from a tragedy into something that ignited public outrage across Georgia news outlets wasn't just what happened on June 16th. It was what investigators and reporters uncovered about who Devin Anthony was before that morning. According to court records reviewed by multiple outlets, including 11 Alive and Law and Crime, Anthony was indicted by a Fulton County grand jury in September of 2021 for murder, in connection with the shooting death of a man named Ronald Barner in southwest Atlanta. That charge, murder, did not remain murder for long. Anthony accepted a negotiated plea deal under Georgia's First Offender Act, a legal provision designed to give certain defendants, typically first-time offenders, a path to avoid a permanent criminal conviction if they successfully complete the terms of their sentence, including any period of probation. Under that plea agreement, the murder charge was reduced to voluntary manslaughter. A judge sentenced Anthony to 20 years, with 11 months to actually serve behind bars, and the remainder, 19 years, on probation. 11 months. For a man who had been indicted on murder. It's worth pausing here to explain, as plainly as we can, what the First Offender Act is actually designed to do, because it's going to become central to how this story is being discussed publicly. The law exists to give people, often young people, often people facing their first serious criminal charge, a genuine second chance. If a defendant completes probation successfully, without violating its terms, the underlying conviction can eventually be removed from their record entirely, as though it never happened. Supporters of the law argue it prevents a single mistake, however serious, from permanently closing off someone's future. access to employment, housing, and a functioning life after they've served their time. Critics, including, as we'll get into, Shakiya's own family argue that a provision meant for genuine first-time, lower-level offenses is being applied to cases far more serious than it was ever designed to cover. A murder indictment, reduced to manslaughter, resolved with less than a year actually served, is, in their view, exactly the kind of outcome that provision should never have permitted. According to reporting from WSB TV, Anthony's probation was revoked in February of 2026 after he failed a drug test, a clear violation of the terms that had allowed him to remain out of custody on the first offender status in the first place. He was returned to custody. And then, in February, he was released again. 4 months later, Shakiya Pridgen was dead. He got a second chance, her mother told reporters, in a line that has since been quoted across nearly every piece of coverage on this case. Shakiya doesn't get a second chance. That line captures something this case keeps circling back to. This wasn't, according to what's now publicly known, a case where a system failed to notice a warning sign. The warning sign had already been formally documented, indicted, prosecuted, resolved, and on file, 5 years before Shakiya Pridgen was shot through her bedroom window. In the days following the arrest, Shakiya's family didn't retreat into private grief. They stood in front of cameras, repeatedly, and said, in plain terms, what they believed had happened and why they believed it could have been prevented. "You willing to kill your own child? You'll kill anybody," one family member said in an interview that circulated widely on local Atlanta news. "You don't have a heart. You're just a missing sight." Another put it more bluntly, aimed directly at the system that had allowed Devin Anthony back onto the street twice. He shouldn't have been let out to be on the streets in the first place. How do you murder twice? Somebody dropped the ball. The system failed us. Felonies shouldn't get first offense, another family member said. A sentiment that, whatever its legal nuance, captures the emotional core of what this family has been saying publicly since the day of the arrest. It's worth being precise here about what is and isn't in dispute. Georgia's First Offender Act is a real, functioning part of the state's legal code, and its use in Anthony's 2021 case was, as far as public reporting indicates, legally sound, a plea deal negotiated and accepted through the ordinary channels of the justice system, approved by a judge. Nothing in the public record suggests that anything about that 2021 process was improper or corrupt. It was, by all available accounts, the system working exactly as designed, which is precisely what Shakiya's family finds so difficult to accept. Not that something went wrong in a hidden, negligent way, but that the system worked as intended, and the outcome was still, in their view, a second homicide. This case has already become part of a broader public conversation in Georgia about whether the First Offender Act, in its current form, is being applied appropriately to violent crimes, a conversation that was happening in legal and legislative circles before this case, but one that Shakiya's family has now placed a very specific, very human face on. We want to be fair to every side of this conversation because it's a genuinely complicated policy question, not a simple one. There are people serving time right now under the weight of a single mistake from their early 20s, for whom the First Offender Act represents the only realistic path back to a stable life. There are also, as this case demonstrates, situations where a violent charge was resolved with what many would consider a strikingly short period of incarceration, followed by a second act of violence. Reasonable people, including legislators and legal scholars, disagree sharply about where the line should sit between those two realities. This case is likely to keep that debate active in Georgia for a long time to come. What do you think? Is a case like this an argument for reforming how the First Offender Act applies to violent felony charges specifically, or is it an outlier, a tragic exception that shouldn't be used to rewrite a law that helps far more people than it harms? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of conversation this case has forced into the open. There's another layer to this story that, once you learn it, is genuinely difficult to shake. According to family members who spoke with WCNC in Charlotte, this was not the first time in recent months that this family had gathered to bury a young woman lost to violence at the hands of someone she had once been in a relationship with. Just months before Shakiya's death. In January of 2026, the family buried Shakia's cousin, Serenity Tate. According to Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department, which confirmed details of that earlier case to WCNC, Serenity's death was also connected to domestic violence. "We were looking forward to meeting our grandson this week," Verdina Scott told WCNC. "We trusted him with her." She described the man responsible in that earlier case as someone who'd put on a whole show to seem like the perfect boyfriend, the same word, show, that Shakia's family would later use to describe Devin Anthony. Two cousins, two young women, two men who, according to their families, had once claimed to love them. Two funerals, 5 months apart. "We are living in dangerous times," one family member told WCNC, "and it's the people that are close to us that will hurt us. It's the kind of detail that resists easy narrative shaping, because there isn't a clean lesson sitting inside it. It doesn't explain what happened to Shakiya. It doesn't predict it, either." Grief and pattern aren't the same thing as proof, and we're not suggesting the two cases are legally connected in any way, because nothing in the public record indicates that they are. But for this particular family, in this particular year, it means something specific and almost unbearable. They are being asked to carry two entirely separate losses, each shaped by the same kind of betrayal, within the same handful of months. Shakia's family has said publicly that Serenity's death, and now Shakia's, have become part of the reason they're pushing so hard, so publicly, for accountability, not just in Devin Anthony's individual case, but in how the broader system responds to domestic violence and to defendants with violent histories more generally. "We're lost," one family member told WCNC. "We don't know what we're going to do." And yet, in nearly every piece of footage from the weeks following Shakia's death, this same family kept showing up, kept standing in front of cameras, kept saying, in one form or another, the same core message: "This will not be the last time you hear from us." Both of Shakia's children came through that morning physically unharmed, a detail that, given everything else about this case, borders on the inexplicable. They're being raised now by family, according to Verdina Scott, who has taken on the role of caring for her grandchildren in the aftermath of losing her daughter. In interviews since, she's described the particular quiet cruelty of watching two young children slowly begin to notice their mother's absence in the ways young children do. Not through direct understanding, but through the small daily habits of a household that no longer make sense. She going to get her little book bag and say, "I'm going to go to my mama." "Time to go," Scott told reporters, describing her granddaughter's routine, the muscle memory of a 3-year-old who hasn't yet been able to fully process that the routine no longer applies. Child development experts, broadly speaking, describe this stage of early grief in young children in similar terms across many different kinds of loss. A 3-year-old is old enough to notice absence, to ask about it, to carry fragmented, sensory memories of a parent forward into later life, the sound of a voice, the specific way a room felt, even without fully being able to construct a coherent narrative around what happened. A 1-year-old, developmentally, is unlikely to retain any explicit memory of his mother at all. He will grow up knowing her only through photographs, through the stories his family chooses to tell him, through a version of Shakiya reconstructed entirely secondhand. That's an enormous responsibility for a family already carrying so much grief of its own. To be, essentially, the keepers of a story a child is too young to have witnessed themselves, tasked with making sure a mother who loved fiercely and openly doesn't become, over the years, a distant abstraction to the two people who mattered to her most. Shakiya's family has said publicly that raising these two children, alongside honoring her memory and Kyren's, is now the center of what they're building their lives around, in the wake of a loss none of them were prepared for. As of the most recent public reporting, Devin Anthony remains in custody at the DeKalb County Jail, held without bond. His first court appearance took place days after his arrest. Because of the severity of the charges against him, a magistrate judge did not have the authority to set bond, and the matter has been referred to a superior court judge. The case is expected to move forward toward a grand jury. He has been charged with malice murder, feticide, aggravated assault with intent to murder, and felon in possession of a firearm. Under Georgia law, malice murder carries the possibility of life imprisonment or, depending on the specifics of the case as it proceeds, the possibility of the death penalty, though prosecutors have not, as of current public reporting, formally announced their intentions regarding sentencing. Anthony has not yet entered a plea in open court on these charges, and no trial date has been publicly set as of this reporting. Under the law, he remains presumed innocent unless and until a jury determines otherwise, based on evidence presented at trial, not based on the affidavit, not based on his prior case, and not based on public opinion, however strongly this community has already reacted to what's been alleged. We say that not to undercut anything you've heard in this video, but because it's a distinction that matters every single time, in every case we cover here. The facts as currently alleged are disturbing. They are not, legally speaking, the same thing as a verdict. What we do know, with certainty, is this. A 23-year-old mother of two, 9 months pregnant, with a third child she and her family had just finished naming together, was shot and killed in her own bed. Her unborn son did not survive. Her mother performed CPR on her with her own hands. Her 2 young children survived a night they will spend the rest of their lives being told about, rather than remembering for themselves. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone in a way that's public, where a family's most private devastation becomes, almost immediately, a news story, a case number, a set of charges scrolling across a chyron. Shakiya's family has had to carry that specific weight since the very first morning, standing outside their own home in the rain, answering questions from reporters before they'd had a single private moment to process what had happened. And yet, watching the footage of them across the weeks since, at press conferences, at a vigil held in her memory, outside the jail where Devin Anthony has been held, what comes through most clearly isn't just anger, even though the anger is there, and it's justified. What comes through is how consistently they return to who Shakiya actually was, underneath everything this case has since become. She saved us, one family member said, describing how Shakiya, in her final moments, was positioned between her children and the gunfire that came through that window, whether by instinct, by chance, or by some combination of both that no one will ever be able to fully untangle. She saved the other little ones. At a vigil held in her memory, her family described her as their earth angel, now, they said, their guardian angel. It's unbelievable at this point, one relative said, that someone just snatched her life away. Her mother, in nearly every interview since, keeps returning to the same handful of images. Shakiya dancing, Shakiya laughing at her own baby shower, Shakiya as a devoted, hands-on mother who could be trusted with anyone's children, not just her own. I could depend on her for anything I needed for my kids, one family friend said. If something was to happen to me, I always wanted Shakiya to be the one to look after them. It lands differently now, in hindsight. A woman other people trusted instinctively to look after their children if something ever happened to them, gone while trying, in whatever way she could in those final seconds, to protect her own. Shakiya Pridgen was buried alongside her son, Kyren, according to family members who spoke to reporters ahead of the funeral. A mother laid to rest with the baby boy she never got to hold outside of her own body, wrapped, as her mother put it, tightly in her arms. This case is still moving through the courts. There will be a grand jury. There will, eventually, be a trial, and a jury will have to reach a conclusion that no amount of public outrage can substitute for. We'll be following it carefully as it develops, the same way we've tried to walk through it here, factually, and with the seriousness this case and this family deserve. But whatever a courtroom eventually decides, some parts of this story are already, permanently, true. A 23-year-old mother named Shakiya Pridgen hosted her own baby shower on a Sunday in June, surrounded by family scattered across 5 states, and helped choose a name for her unborn son. 3 days later, she was gone. so was he. Her mother is now raising two small children who will grow up needing to be told, rather than remembering who their mother was. And a family that has already buried one young woman this year to violence at the hands of someone who once claimed to love her is now standing at a second grave, asking the same unanswered question a system built to give people second chances has left them with. How many chances does one person get before somebody else runs out of them entirely? If this story affected you, we'd ask that you share it. Not for the numbers, but because cases like this tend to fade out of the news cycle faster than the people living through them ever get to heal. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, particularly on the conversation this case has reopened around Georgia's First Offender Act. And if you want to be here when this case reaches its next stage, go ahead and subscribe, because we'll be following it every step of the way. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.